You may be wondering after the long dark what game I would critique next, and I thought I'd go back to the basics with something foundational, something of a staple amongst critics, something raw with passion, something like Doom. Doom is what? No, this is not another video discussing Doom Eternal. What on earth gave you that impression? No, that wasn't a play on words, it's a figure of speech. Whoa there, Shakespeare, me thinkest thou protest too much. Look, you're derailing this entire point of the video. Let me just rewind this back from the start. What is there left to say about a franchise that has been nearly critiqued by everyone? And more importantly for you, the viewer, what is the purpose of this intended video? Chances are, if you have any interest in Doom, you are more than familiar with any discussions about its legacy, its level design, its ray casting pseudo 3D technology, its modding scene, its orthogonal unit differentiation of combat. Essentially, every enemy and weapon in Doom is distinct for different situations, and it's hundreds of other major and minor analyses out there. Like the Doom Marine through the hordes of hell, reviewers have essentially gutted this franchise and laid them bare for rumination in their wake. Instead of breaking down a single mechanic for one game or across the series, I would rather examine an aspect not necessarily overlooked, yet it's something less tangible to discuss without the context of the whole series. This topic is Doom's differing expectations over the years, and the different playstyles that each game caters to accommodate, and how these connotations from Doom are created not only by designers, but also by players through play and by modders. Essentially, this video will discuss the divide between what players and or creators believe what makes Doom what it is, and how these contradictions can spawn from the same foundation. As innately subjective as this thesis proposes, it'll be rooted in objective components of these games, such as the level design, mechanics, AI, and other related discussions, but consider this video's purpose is meant to critique these games and related mods as a whole, not a series of individual reviews. If you desire the latter material, my curator page has written reviews of Doom 3 and 4, which will share some similar ideas here, but they are not mandatory. However, this video will probably be the only time I will ever find a reason to talk about the classic Doom games. Any supplementary material, such as map layouts from classicdoom.com and GDC footage, will be used in the video to illustrate my points, but they are not mandatory to watch for full context. Ideas referenced from other user videos, however, would be better understood if you had watched them beforehand, which these videos were chosen to substantiate my own criticisms I have less experience in discussing. These videos include Ray Severic's The Brilliance of Doom soundtrack, Mark Brown's What Can We Learn from Doom and Finding the Fun in FPS campaigns, and AI in Games, The AI of Doom 2016. Now before we can begin, I would like to state up front what software I am capturing for footage. All footage from the classic Doom games and affiliated mods are from GZ Doom, including Doom 64 Retribution, whereas Doom 3 and Resurrection of Evil are their original releases. The BFG edition is not something I'm going to talk about, nor the Lost Chapter, as I have no interest in purchasing that version. Finally, footage taken from Doom 2016 was recorded thanks to DragonX to help create this video. And before you ask, I have played nearly 30 hours across 2 playthroughs, on Ultraviolence and on Nightmare, and a few extra hours on the arcade mode. If I were to record footage on my monitor, it would have to be 400 by 500 if I would want a similar smooth frame rate. As much as the result would be fitting alongside the classic games, the pixelated quality wouldn't sit well with most people, so I appreciate his help. You can imagine how distraught he was when I asked him if he could go to hell for me. He didn't ask for any plugins, so I feel it's only polite to recommend 2 videos with similar topics from his game design series, Design Bites. These include What Modern FPSs Can Learn from Duke Nukem 3D and Sonic Forces Actionable Information. In many ways, all these games are great examples of these topics in practice. Without any other necessary information, let's stop stalling. Oh, damn it to hell, I should have saved that for the Wolfenstein review. Anyway, let's begin with examining the fundamental question. As much as the 90s were my childhood, Doom was never formally introduced to me until I had watched my father play Doom 3 on its release. He had told me once or twice about the longest nights he had spent playing the original over the weekends as he huddled around the monitor, seemingly lost in the catacomb-like mazes as he etched out his map from the dim light of the flickering screen. He never mentioned if he had played the other games, but he did mention he had played Descent with my uncle and he had to use cheat codes to beat the final boss. My stepbrother and I were too young at the time to be confident to play Doom 3 on our own, so we watched him instead. After he was finished with work and my stepbrother and I were done with our homework, we sat on either side of the desk, watching in silence, although my father had an interesting way of playing Doom 3. On his lap he had this official Doom 3 strategy guide bookmark. One hand rested on the keyboard and the other gripped around this joystick meant for flight simulation games. He is also left-handed, so he had to use the arrow keys instead of the WASD setup. Instead of glancing at the guidebook every now and then, every time he entered a new room, he would read the page, find out where the enemies were coming next, what items and secrets were in the room, and he read through all the PDA entries he could find. And if he couldn't find the combination for a locker, he used the book. Several times he would cycle through his weapon choices, checking his reserves and the amount of light each gun provided. He had downloaded one of those duct tape mods, and one time I replaced it with the Hello Kitty variant as a joke, before he entered the next dark corridor. He never told us what we would expect, and he would always over-dramatize the ambushes as my stepbrother and I jumped out of their seats. Whenever we asked him why he played that way, he responded, that was just how he played games. Although I always thought he was messing with us, such as the one time he had pretended he had thrown our wiener dog into the dryer and it came out Chihuahua. You may be wondering, besides how dull Let's Plays were before YouTube was invented, what this anecdote has anything to do with describing Doom. As amusing of a memory, this impression has always stuck with me when years later, my stepbrother and I played Doom 3 on the original Xbox cooperatively, and then I returned to the original years later when I migrated to the PC. As unconventional of an introduction, this foundation is where my perspective of the series originated. It may be an extreme case with a title framed on one end of the spectrum, yet others are bound to have their own personal deviations, such as playing on specific consoles or only on PC. The only major key points to take away is that my background is like many fans who grew up on Doom 3, whereas my father's perspective resembles those who grew up only on the original. However, both experiences would be greatly different to veterans who have played the entire series, console ports, and thousands of mod creations back to back. In addition, all these perspectives would be at odds to newcomers who have only played the 2016 reboot and/or the brutal, insert old school FPS, epidemic. Whatever their differences, minor source port changes, or major overhauls, is there any common framework we can all agree defines Doom? This type of question brings up several more worth considering. Is any one of these perspectives inherently skewed by experience, or the lack thereof? Are there any misconceptions over the years from one game to the next that has deviated the series from its original course? Are mods, source ports, or extra features like cooperative play antithetical to what makes Doom what it is? Or is the problem simply time, dozens upon dozens of iterations, and changing interests that are the culprits behind a series mistranslation to various people? Doom is a series with all these viewpoints and related questions seemingly at odds with one another, showcasing how important are players' priorities of what defines these games, and, more importantly, how a Doom game is meant to be played. Intended experience is a loosely defined term for game analysis that is better thought of as the pedagogy or the teaching methods of a game. Usually this term denotes the clear, though not always transparent, developer guidelines that teach players what is the correct and the incorrect method to play, such as taking damage for a wrong action, or to use another term, conveyance. Sometimes this aspect involves what is often dubbed a vertical slice of the gameplay that translates to how players are meant to act. For example, sometimes games opt for a play it your way method that allows multiple approaches with some general structure like Far Cry, where you can knock out all the guards or you can murder them all before the alarms go off. Unlike games, pedagogical frameworks are all focused around how a teacher conducts a classroom. Games are their own facilitator and their own environment to teach through play. These common pedagogical frameworks are developed around how the teacher conducts a classroom, whether it is a traditional teacher-led manner, essentialist, a student-led exploration through questions and experience, progressivist, or teaching fundamental, everlasting values that can be applicable to different situations, perennialist. The parallels to gaming are a bit more abstract, but they are largely the same. Traditional tutorials, essentialist, learning by experience or exploration of mechanics alone or with others, progressivist, or learning by other games within a similar genre, perennialist, like first-person controls. These deviations are why, for this video, intended experience is not limited to the developers, but also how players teach themselves, as well as how they influence other players. In order to understand where Doom's deviations arise, we must not only start from the first game, but also how the first game was meant to be played. Hardly will many people nowadays choose to play Doom from its default settings, as we live in an era where everyone has played a source port with free aiming, resolution qualities that don't make you sick every time you look up and down, and other modern accessible features. It also may be obvious to point out the differences between how people play Doom today versus how people played it in the past. Yet it warrants examining how different these styles of gameplay are when compared. More importantly, it's vital to understand how the game was originally meant to be played with its original controls and what kind of gameplay it fostered, which centers around three main aspects: speed, combat, and exploration. At a time when WASD and other first-person conventions were not yet established, the original Doom relied solely on a keyboard for its awkward controls. Specific limitations and design choices were made to work around its constraints, such as aiming being only directional with no regard for distance or height, or how enemy projectiles are slower than other games to make up for its clumsy controls. This setup encourages more methodical gameplay where speed is only prioritized in times of desperation or as an opportunity to take a new vantage point, and positioning is more important than constant momentum with respect to the level design. Similar to a game like chess, except instead of checking mates with kings, it's about blasting demons away like any good Christian. You must plan future moves in advance and position yourself to strike when it is best convenient. This movement system also dictates why enemies have one given role and limited AI behaviors, as the game realizes control is part of the fundamental challenge. If you have been watching this gameplay footage, you'll probably be able to imagine my fingers stumbling over themselves whenever I alternate between strafing with the Alt key and running with the Shift key. Sometimes moving back and forward with the arrow keys alone is the only plausible maneuver to avoid damage. Aiming is a secondary concern, as movement takes a higher priority to stay alive, and perhaps this difficulty prompted adding in fighting mechanics, though that is only speculation. Yet facing the enemy is also how the movement affects combat, which encourages taking these levels slow. Now players can, and many have, become adept at this system, and they can work around its limitations with enough time and memorization of enemy ambushes. But it's obvious how more quickly and how more easily the gameplay becomes with free look and WASD enabled. Whatever method you choose to play, great level design is what prevents the combat from becoming too excessive with the default controls, and the level design also prevents the navigation from becoming too cryptic for modern audiences. Having great level design is one of those often meaningless statements that many people do not explain what they mean. As my personal definition, level design should tell stories through what players experience that challenge them to become aware of their surroundings for navigation, for goals to work towards, or for their own safety. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to use Dan Taylor's 10 Principles for Good Level Design from his GDC conference in 2013.
There it is again. Good level design is fun to navigate. Create a clear visual language, but feel free to throw in some chaos. Good level design does not rely on words to tell a story. Use implicit and emergent narrative rather than explicit. Good level design tells the player what to do, but not how to do it. Use clearly communicated objectives that players can complete in any way or order they want. Good level design constantly teaches the player something new. It keeps the player engaged by continuously introducing or subverting new mechanics. Good level design is surprising. Don't be afraid to take risks with the pacing, aesthetics, or any other elements. Good level design empowers the player. Video games are escapism. Let the player feel the impact of his actions. Good level design is easy, medium, and hard. Use risk-reward so that the player can set the difficulty dynamically. Good level design is efficient, designed for modularity, bidirectionality, and non-linearity, and lots of other arities. Good level design creates emotion. It begins at the end with the desired emotional response and works backwards to select the appropriate mechanics to elicit that response. And good level design is driven by the game's mechanics. Above all, it showcases the game's mechanics through the medium of the level to reinforce the uniquely interactive nature of video games. And those are the 10 principles of good level design.
Doom has essentially conceived all things in heaven and earth from its mechanics than most games can ever dream of from this design philosophy. Nearly every level manages to tell its own narrative through clear communication of goals, exit doors, and key cards, and there are enough peaks and troughs of play that solving these levels are their own reward. The rhythm created between gameplay is akin to composing music, where the verses break up the melodic monotony of the overall chorus. And this interplay between action and inaction is what defines the pacing of Doom. Take the level Command Central, where you need a blue keycard to access this door. Instead of funneling you towards the keycard, this area offers various routes and ambushes with high and low tension combined with the level's verticality, light obstacles, and tons of secrets to reward any curious player. Along this route, the imps throwing fireballs here will make you aware of the next obstacle, the yellow door, which leads to the exit. Many levels follow this format, and despite how basic it may seem after several hours, the first 3 episodes always include new elements, or new hazards like boss enemies turned into new common threats, new weapons, or new level design gimmicks to prevent stagnation. Among the 3 episodes, which start you off solely from scratch in the ever-encroaching circles of hell, the level design's pacing starts off with something simpler, yet still challenging, and it ramps up the complexity of each stage across subsequent episodes to continually test players. The 4th episode, Thy Flesh Consumed, however, is where the game's quality and its difficulty curve reach a breaking point. Even as its own monstrosity, the design is haphazard at best given how much it cobbles together previous ideas into one frustrating experience. This episode is something only those dedicated to the series should tackle on the ultra-violent setting, as the first 2 levels throw numerous harder threats from the get-go than most reasonable players can barely manage such meager resources. At best, these engagements are more tedious than they should be. One example that illustrates how absurd is this episode is that the second level hides a BFG that you have to clip into one random wall that is almost essential given how much you have to clear out multiple Barons of Hell and a Cyber Demon. Despite these complaints, this expansion is not where the series first began to deviate from its original identity. That honor goes to Doom 2, which depending on how you play it, the game is either a regression from what made the original superb, or the next logical conclusion for Doom.